congrats to the artists. There's a great review that just came out from Kate and Quaid about the show. The show looks great, and there's a lot to talk about today. So we've got some notes about, that'll help us steer the conversation. And first we want to know a little bit about who you are. And so you've been paired together in this show as, painters, both painting landscapes, capturing moments in time, and heavily emphasizing technique and lighting. The whole show, the paintings are about memory. Standing Still, the concept of the group show, the two-person show, talks about memory a lot. And it's whether memory is a visual representation of literal memory or the suggestion of certain time and place that's only implied. So we're about to learn more about you guys as painters, but before that, why don't we take a minute or two to sort of hear who you are as individuals, as people just living in the world. And maybe we'll start with Bill.
All right. My name is Wilhelm Neusser, and I'm born in Germany, in Cologne, quite a while ago, and went to art school there, and came to the US following my now wife about 12 years ago. And it took me a little while to settle in here and find my way into the art scene, which good friends have been very helpful. So by now this is home, and I work here and work with the gallery by now for 6 years, roundabout.
So my name is Mishael Coggeshall-Burr. I was born in Boston, actually. I grew up in rural New Hampshire. My parents were sort of back to the land hippies in the late 70s. So I grew up in a sort of a non-American style upbringing in America. No electricity or running water. Till I was about 15, we moved. And sometimes I wonder if that doesn't somehow inform my interest in traveling and being the other, or being in an unusual, being in a situation where I may have felt that way when I was younger too. And let's see, I studied painting in college and met my amazing wife. And we were actually on a trip to Mozambique, which wasn't part of college. But once we both left the school we were at, we realized how much we had in common, and so we've had sort of international fling ever since then. And it's involved 4 children now. So we've settled in Western Mass. We bought an old farmhouse, probably too old. As it turned out. And another aspect to myself is I'm sort of a maker. I studied painting, and I also studied physics in school. I went to a school where you could combine 2, sort of unrelated disciplines, and neither department was particularly interested in doing it, but they kind of had to. And it was, I've used some of those knowledge of physics, I guess, learning how to repoint bricks and fix, our old house. So I spend a lot of my time cut between raising children, working on our old place. I have a day job in the physics realm. I work in a local college supporting the labs there, and painting in a studio out in our house. And I'm lucky enough to be showing here with Wilhelm.
Nice. Great. All right, in a studio visit, preparing for this exhibition, Wilhelm used the phrase armchair traveler. And Kaylee had noted this from the visit, and I was very curious about this term, armchair travelers. And so the question is, first say that this is perfectly describes the feeling that you get looking from both bodies of work, and also the idea of standing still, right? That you're standing still and you're sort of looking at this as an armchair traveler. But Bill, can you explain this phrase a little bit? And then Mishael, if I'm curious if this resonates with you also. So why don't we
Yeah, I think like when I'm in the studio working, I'm listening to a lot of like YouTube stuff and lectures on art history. I have a sweet tooth for art history too, and so I think it came up in the context of Dutch landscape painting of the 17th century, and it was about the beginning of landscape painting when people would sit at home and enjoy a depiction of another place, which previously wasn't that common, and it was mostly born around that time because there was a whole new kind of class popping up, which is the bourgeois class, the burghers, I guess, as the Dutch suggest. Before it was mostly either church or aristocracy. So now there are people who kind of connected with the place and the land they lived in through the depiction of the landscape. And the seascape with big vessels and ships was about the new riches of a new society, or the windmills, the most innovative, the newest technique at the time. And so there was something about being at home while using the depiction of the painting as a means to be at another place. Right? And then later, in the following centuries, the armchair traveler was the person that maybe brought something home from the Grand Tour going to Italy or so, bringing it home and enjoying it almost as a souvenir. And there's the notion of memory included. And then it pops up again in the context of Romanticism in the US, when you think of painters like Bierstadt. They travel to the far west, depict the vastness of the landscape, but it's enjoyed in the salon on Fifth Avenue by the noble reach of the industrial class. So the idea of landscape as a place that can be enjoyed without being at the place that it depicts.
Mm-hmm.
There's a definition of landscape painting in there.
Right. And are you feeling like these landscapes? Are you contributing? Are you contributing to that experience for the viewer, or are you creating kind of an envy that the person might wish that they were there?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, what we talk about here is the notion of landscape and place, and I'm curious if a landscape needs necessarily a place, and I think we probably have a lot to talk about in this context, because I think of my paintings as landscapes, but not necessarily so much of them as place. Because what happens to me a lot, people come and say like, oh, where's this? Is this at the cave? Is this here or there? And with certain like motifs, it's maybe more likely that you can kind of localize it in a certain region or not, but not with any like those places that could be anywhere. And it's much more like a concept of landscape, rather than saying, I've been there. You might want to say, I would like to be there, which is a different type of projection, but it's different from the notion of maybe souvenir. So yeah, I mean, maybe another aspect that comes to mind is, traveling. You mentioned it before, the notion of tourism as souvenir. You remember something of where you've been, or you're projecting on something where you might want to be. Enough for me.
So the armchair traveler phrase, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable, because for me it's the painting process and the goal is something that should be engaging someone. So it's a very active, what I'm hoping is a very active response. And I think for me, the armchair traveler phrase, maybe in the modern sense, is more like passive, like someone who is maybe scared to go really, but they'll like read about it a little bit and pictures. But I mean, when you think about it in terms of going somewhere and having a memento, then that connects more with what I do. But I think it's important for me that the painting, the purpose of the painting in a way is to make a connection with someone. And so maybe you can think of that as armchair, connection somehow.
Right, but specificity is important for you, right? In
Yes.
terms of like the location.
Yeah. For the whole process, it's based on a photograph to begin with, and in order for me to sort of decide to work from a picture, it's really hard to describe it. It's like the image has to embody itself. It has to be good enough representing that moment and have enough potential to invest your work into. And so that is really rooted in like this particular instant in time, in a place. But because it's blurred, and it creates this other layer, which makes it more general.
Right. I like the distinction with the armchair traveler phrase, because I think that there's something about that, the passivity or the it's like when you talk about what was armchair psychology or whatever,
Right.
Monday morning quarterbacking or whatever. Something that strikes me about these paintings is that they come out of a long tradition. That obviously you're working with materiality of paint, but you're also like pictorially, you're sort of. I mean, if I were to pinpoint it in time, I think that Impressionism is sort of a germinating movement that then sort of this work comes from. And this is sort of a question for both of you to kind of look at each other's work and sort of respond to it. So you're using abstraction to distort and fracture reality in the pictorial description, but also some of the conceptual underpinnings of the images. And thinking about the tradition of Impressionism. And it's like, from a distance, these, and maybe Mishael's, your work from a further distance summarizes into the realistic image. Wilhelm's feels more realistic, but then in both cases, when you get closer, they become really distorted into their, elements, and Kate McQuaid used the word pixelation in regard to that too. And I'm kind of curious how each of you feel this technique, or being part of this long tradition, works in service to the paintings. So, Mishael, I'm sort of curious, when you look at Wilhelm's work and you see, when you get closer and you see this this sort of technique played out, what's your feeling of that?
Well, I think that the marks we make as painters is very personal, and it's sort of the culmination of our experience in those decisions, and that's what makes the painting beautiful. That uniqueness, that signature. You don't have to write your name; it's in it, and it's something you can't fake. It just takes time. No,
Sure.
Well, when this show came together, and I came here several times and saw the work side by side, I noticed that I feel like in terms of luminosity and certain ideas of landscape painting and Impressionism, I'm not so sure if that's a good through line, but what they have in common, I think, is a sense of light and how light and space interact. And then at the same time, I think we're ending up I think we're coming to a similar thing from very different directions. Like, you travel, you document through photography, and then work from there to the painting. So you're coming from actually a very specific experience of place, and you, as you said earlier, you generalize it, right? And I feel like my paintings, barely start from any specific location, or they don't mean any specific location, but they end up being quite precise for not depicting a place. So, but I think, like, in terms of the aesthetic, we're following a similar concept, but we're coming from different directions there.
And the idea of memory that is a through line with all of this work. I wonder if we could take a minute for each of you to describe briefly and to elaborate on some of the specific ones that are on display and what those memories are.
I have some ideas. There's so the paintings that are on display now are all from those two are from this last fall in Budapest on the way to Ukraine. My wife was traveling there, and I saw her as far as Budapest before going back to Parent. And last May we went to Ukraine together, and these photographs are a mixture of Ukraine and Poland. There's two in Ukraine. And so for me, those are really powerful connections, sort of touchstones to that experience, and wanting to, from that trip and going there, wanting to support those people. And I'm an artist, so I make paintings. And some of the proceeds from that went towards the foundation my wife is running, which is building housing for internally displaced Ukrainians. So, in general, all have to do with travel, but these particularly have this added layer, emotional layer of the intensity around the experience of observing and wanting to help.
Mm-hmm. Nice, and then they maintain that memory for you too, right? Like,
Oh yeah.
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 How about you?
So in other words, it's very specific to a place and to a time. When you talk about war-torn Ukraine, so it's you have been at a specific place at a specific time, and it's like together it's a little bit.
Yes.
And so in that sense, like I don't think my paintings have any of this, but at the same time, there is something that could be compared to memory, and I would say it's maybe more like yearning. It's more like and yearning again is more like a projection rather than a memory, but it's related to kind of almost like a very general, I don't know how to say it, but more like a genuine notion of place that we in a more kind of almost like, I don't know, spiritual or existential sense that we all share. And I think there's a type of landscape that allows for projection by being maybe not so specific in terms of maybe time and place. So we talk about stuff that's out of time, meaning you can't relate to it whenever or maybe even wherever it is. So it's almost like maybe projection is something like, if there's a way to remember the future, it's like taking something that's the summary of everything that you know and projecting it onto something. Maybe it's a little move in that direction.
Yes. Yeah, projection. I like the idea of thinking about projection, almost, like memory, and adding, a memory to it, like a projection, almost astral projection or something. I don't know, kind of like something metaphysical or something. If you guys were to each pick a pair, like if you were to pick two paintings, one of yours and one of yours, in this show that best exemplifies the conceptual aspect of this show, which ones would they be?
That's a trick question.
Which is
I would say red sky and arriving. These figures, those two. I think they're both strong works that show our styles and complement.
Nice. Okay, go on. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I would choose one of the ones with configuration, like something about the busyness and the emptiness in contrast. So yeah, I think maybe one of the more urban kind of, busy inhabited kind of like warm scenes and contrasted with, maybe a very empty and kind of dramatic, anxiously dramatic place. I mean, like a street scene like this one with its warm light has despite the fact that it's actually in a very threatened environment.
Yes, very peaceful that day.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think I would try and create a contrast with a space that's so void that it's almost kind of like scary.
Well, it's peaceful. Like they have a peacefulness to them, but there's also, at least in the night or the mountains, there's the implication that you're in a very cold environment. Like you're in some environment that may be beautiful but hostile.
Right, and that's a fascinating moment, also leading back to notions of landscape in our history. It's like, when nature, initially a very threatening kind of environment that people wanted to stay out of. That's why armchair traveling was so welcome. Because you didn't have to go there and still could enjoy it. Right? And before that, it became landscape, meaning like a place that was manicured in a way that it painting. So yeah, I think some of these have maybe a coldness or a rawness that's maybe peaceful in the sense of untouched, but not necessarily peaceful in the sense of inviting.
Welcoming.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads into this next question, which is a painterly question about color. And you know, you've talked about warmth, you've talked about light, and what I'm noticing as a painter is that there's an inventiveness in some of the color, but for the most part, you're adhering to a natural palette, like you know, some natural phenomenon such as the red sky or the green night sky. But we're seeing a lot of blues, and in your painting as well, Michelle. It's like, you know, we recognize the color of building, color of roads, color of trees. And so the question is, what are the sort of parameters that you set for yourself, or mechanisms that are in service to the paintings? And what are your, you know, in consideration of color? So how are you designing and developing your palette for these paintings?
So I have a pretty set sort of structure for how I develop painting. Obviously it starts with traveling and taking photographs. So I'll shoot, you know, for every 1,000 pictures, I may get 3, 4 maybe, that could be paintings potentially. And from that, you know, I'm sort of floating around in the studio and thinking about how I would like to approach them and what scale I'd like to approach them. Because I'm shooting pictures that are blurs, roughly speaking, the blur that the lens creates, you can imagine it sort of creating it into these circles. And that's about the size of the brush I want to use for the painting.
Okay.
So there's a question of scale that comes in, you know, and I'm working a little bigger than I used to. So all of those things are kind of floating around. The images themselves can be vastly different. You know, I'll have a bunch of photographs and they'll be all over the map in terms of color schemes, times of day. It's just, does that picture represent that place and time and kind of light that fire when you look at it? For me, that and sometimes, you know, the best case would be you take a bunch of pictures and you put them away for 6 months, and then you open up the file, you look at them again, and there's a few that are going to pop out, and those are the ones worth your time and effort. And so usually I don't have that, you know, time. You kind of learn to look for trends or look for shortcuts, ways to make that simpler process, but ideally you have some time. And then once I have the photograph developed, and it kind of represents for me that color picture, that sort of self-embodied moment is contained in that. It's almost like a talisman. And I have 4x6 print that I'm working from for all the paintings, and that is everything. So for me, that embodies that moment in time. It's like this connection to it through the camera. And from there, the painting happens naturally. I don't know. I think that part is the unexplainable part. But it just happens. So yeah. I mean, generally, like a good image will have, you know, really high dynamic range. So it'll have a really dark blue or black as the most intense, and the lightest will be almost a pure white with like a touch of color of some kind. And other than that, it just depends on the image and the emotion from that moment. You know.
This is great. I want to talk more about the photograph in a little bit, because I'm also really curious what you just said. I didn't know this, that the color that appears in the photograph is integral to the color that ends up on the canvas.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And Will, what about you?
Well, I think for a long time I didn't consider myself, you know, being very what's the word, attentive or attentive is the word. Very, like, my focus on color wasn't that strong, and I think it has gotten a little more important over the last few years. But something that I always come back to is the idea of color versus paint. which is actually the same word in German.
Mhm.
So the material and the hue pretty much is one thing. And in English, one being more the way it appears optically versus the material that the pigment is contained in. So I actually like those duality of it, and that's something I put a lot of emphasis in my work. I like that there's both sides have to be visible, right? So the material has, the paint, the color is the material, and anyway, I'm putting mixed up here. And the material is a color? No. You know what I mean. Yeah, so so the material shows in many different textures, variety, richness in texture. And then when it comes to the hues, then I try also, and that's similar to what you said, have a range with, that creates a certain dynamic defining space, having very dark areas versus very luminous light ones.
And do you feel like you design your palette to create mood as well?
Well, there's something about the treatment of the oil paint that, you might call it a sfumato or something where, certain kind of blending happens from lighter to darker areas and thereby creating atmosphere, and depending on the hue of the tone, it might come across as somewhat, melancholy. I mean, it's automatically going into a specific direction. We're talking about 19th century here. And yes, I think there is a strong relationship to mood. Yes.
Well, yeah, definitely in both bodies of work, there's the effect. Color does create a sense of mood, energy, and it's a curious question for all painters. I think it's like when you're picking the color to make something that's a representational image, you have so many choices. It can be completely unrealistic, totally exaggerated, or it can adhere to a very, what they call local color or realistic color. And I think you guys are somewhere in between here. You're being playful and creative, inventive, but you're also having the viewer recognize what they're seeing based on color as well as form.
Can I add something? So there's a few things that complicate this question. And my interest is in recreating a feeling of a moment that maybe someone else would share, I guess, in a simple way. And paint is inherently limiting. You can't create the same experiences as light is giving your eyes in the real world. So any painter who's ever painted is automatically given this limitation that they work within. And maybe it's important to them, maybe it's not. But I love it. I like the challenge. And it's like, here are the rules, you can only do so much, and see what you can do. This is what people have done before. Have a crack at it. And that to me is like, it makes it much more rich. And I don't know, there's a craft element to it. And just as a last note, to get the color that you want, I don't know about Wilhelm, but often for me it will take several tries. Not just mixing the color on the palette, but the mark you make on the canvas. The best ones, in my experience, the color is created as the brush is moving, and there's elements of the mixture that you can see, but also the final color. Kind of like the painting, you can see the marks, but also the full, everything coming together at once. So it's like...
I noticed this about your work, and I was curious if I was observing or witnessing decision making, and what you just said now makes me wonder: is this actually? I'm sure there's decision making in it, but are you finding color by running one color through the other, or do you put down a color, change your mind, put down another color, change your mind, put down another color, and then we see the mix happen with that?
Yeah, a lot of it would be happy accidents. If you're working, and I like working wet and wet. If I could have my way, the whole canvas would be wet for like 3 weeks, and I could just jump around and play, and work some purple in here. So you also have momentation of the paint itself, the material. And if you're really in a good place, I find that I can kind of work, from one area and kind of expand out. It grows, and that growing edge I can keep wet, and but that really, it doesn't happen every time. And you have to have a lot of faith that you made the right decision here or to work here.
Right.
So, you'll jump around, and some of it is luck. You'll have a wet spot, and Like, well, I see some yellow here, and oh, that makes it. Now it works, and so you go back and change it. But it's a process that's luck, that's fluid.
And the fact that these are all oil paintings, I think, contribute to that process. That you couldn't do it if they dried really fast. You need that at that time. Wilhelm, what does that sound like to you in terms of the limitations of paint?
Well, I don't know.
It's not fun to think about limitations.
Right. No, I don't think any of us want to think that there's a limitation on it. But to your point, Mishael, that you are like using that as a way, as a challenge, as a something to be inspired by.
I think we have something. We have agreed to do it because we're painting.
Right.
You know, that is part of the pact.
Right. Okay, so I want to jump to this next question, which is connected in a way. It's about markmaking. In both artists' work, the artist's hand is present in the painting through signature markmaking and a vocabulary of unique marks. And I think we're talking about this a little bit with these marks that you're saying, and then you go back and learn happy accidents. But there's definitely, there's certain long brush strokes or short brush strokes, wide brush strokes, dappling, splattering. There's these different techniques that you each have developed for your paintings. And I just want to read a little bit from Kate McQuaid's review. Coggeshall-Burr uses fat, yummy brushstrokes to blur his scenes. The colors almost pixelate, and the tactility of the paint tempts touch. Right? It's a beautiful phrasing, and I think that is a result of your the vocabulary of markmaking that you've put together, and Wilhelm, you as well. There are certain techniques, and you describe actually in the I have all these literature here. Neusser thinks of this, we're talking about the splatter, in relation to the cranberry bog paintings, where the splatters were cranberries and now they're stars. And Neusser thinks of this technique as central to his painting language, and saying I'm simply using similar words to create different poems. So let's talk about that a little bit, the signature mark making.
Yeah. Well, I think, like the longer we do this, there's something like a very physical side of things, which is almost like muscle memory, where you come back to certain type of moves with your hand, or with a certain tool, a brush or a palette knife or whatever. And I think that shows like from work to work. And yeah, like for example, the idea of the dripping to create like a dot in a certain type of color that is so sharp I could never paint it by hand. It's just the physicality of the material at that moment. And it has been the cranberries initially, and then I just again took that word and transferred it into different sense, creating different meaning. And I think we kind of do similar things with all kind of moves that we practice. And I don't know, maybe it's comparable to a soccer player who has certain moves and he does that trick. Trick sounds difficult, but he does that over and over again, right? And I think that automatically will create a certain aesthetic and language that's signature style.
And I've had the privilege of being in your studio many times, and so I've kind of seen how the sausage is made. And there are a lot of tools, and maybe we can expand this question into the tools that you're using. I know you've developed specific brushes and certain tools to use. You have to work on some of these canvases not vertically but horizontally, and so how is that developed, and how do you use this in your vocabulary?
Well, I do believe that the kind of richness or that diversity on the surface comes through all different kind of treatments, right? And by literally like working the painting in all kinds of ways and using all kind of different maybe viscosities of the material, and so it hopefully shows as a rich surface, as a lively surface, not so much coming out of the motif, but coming out of almost like the topography of what's happening on the surface. I mean, I said, I like to think about the color and the paint, and I love to think about depicting something that's related to nature, but also think of the nature of the painting, like its texture and structure. The nature of the material is there's just moments when you squeeze paint around with a palette knife, and there's something that has an aesthetic to it that's so much closer to some natural phenomenon than you could have ever, or I could have ever rendered it in a more illustrational sense.
Mishael, what are your thoughts on your vocabulary that you've built up in Markmaking and the tools you use to get those effects?
I think any creative process to some degree is iterative, right? You do something, you see it done, you make a decision, you copy it or not, or you repeat it or not, or what things you liked about it or you didn't, or what worked, what didn't. And so, as an output of that function, you get, what we do with our hands, but it's evolving, it's always changing. So, and there might be moments that you like better than others that are elusive. You can't go back and recreate them because you move past that. There may be things that in painting you don't recognize until well after you painted it. There may be things that you do that are totally accidental, and they're wonderful, and you don't realize it, and you get rid of it because it doesn't meet what your current expectations are for what you're doing. And so, some of it's blind luck, but a lot of it's just, if you spend enough time doing something, these habits form. And you decide, is it a good habit? Is it a useful habit? And I don't know, I take sublime pleasure in Markmaking. I think it's so fun, especially at the end of a painting, when you're just putting the finishing touches that bring it to life. The endorphin high is pretty. There might be shouting involved.
Wonderful. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about photography, because I know the source of photography can be is often the source imagery, especially in Mishael's work. And Wilhelm, I know you referenced some photographic imagery, especially the painting behind you. And I think, to understand what a sky, mountain, and kind of landscapes look like, you are researching a lot, looking at photography. So, you both use photography as reference or source imagery. And what is each of your relationship to photography within the process? And how important is it that the evidence of the actual photograph is in the final painting? You touched on this a little bit in terms of color and also in scale. And are these paintings in any way a commentary on photography?
So, I sometimes literally have a photo either from a computer or maybe as a printout next to my canvas and kind of work from it. Often working, starting with it and working away, but it's there as a clear reference. What I do have much more is have, photograph imagery handy or somebody in mind, even a direct reference for a painting. So for example, I have a huge collection of colored postcards, especially older ones from the 50s and 70s, 60s, 70s, but there's this kind of weirdly, recolored kind of form of black and white. So there's a certain interest in the color range, but also in terms of the composition, which again goes back to certain ideas of painting, and that combination is very important. I have a whole bunch of books on landscape painting, so it's actually photos of paintings, so you could argue I'm looking at photos, right? Or landscape, books on landscapes. So I think, yes, photo as a reference is important for me, maybe not so much for color, but for concept and composition. Sometimes it happens to me, I tear out, the cover picture of the New York Times when it's a really strong aerial view or something. Not necessarily painting it right away, one-to-one, but almost adding it to a kind of mental visual archive. And at some point you'll see a through line of a certain type of, again, like a genuine kind of type of landscape.
But do you ever consider the kind of like single lens view kind of optical experience of a photograph in relation to your paintings? You know,
Again, like some paintings start with that, or going a certain way from there, and others don't have that at all, and they're coming more out of like almost like a distilled DNA of a whole archive of pictures, which means there's a sort of horizon line, there's a sort of gradient, so but it's drawn out of photography. So again, as a source, yes, but not necessarily for every painting.
So for me, the photography is crucial, and as an artist, you find yourself doing things, and as you're doing them, you think, why am I doing this? And so there's the sense that you're always working forward, but there's also you kind of digging backward and trying to figure out why it is that you're gravitated toward these things. And so for me, maybe part of the photography experience originated from necessity. I wasn't able to sit and paint in these places and spend the time I wanted to spend, or day after day, spend a certain part of each day. So this is a sort of shorthand for me to get into the studio and put that focus into that moment. And it makes it harder in a lot of ways, because you have to first recreate that moment by developing a photograph, finding a photograph that's worth it, and then working on it. But the photograph for me also, because of this process, it's tied to memory. So because our memories aren't, at least my memories aren't sort of crystal clear. They're often very blurry. And so the blurred photograph, for some reason, for me, captures memories of experiences better. And it happens to connect to painting in a way that I love the beauty of this blurred image, but it hasn't realized its full potential until it's become paint. So I haven't figured out why, but it is, I think for me personally, it's tied to some way of tapping into memories, of accessing them, solidifying them, sharing them, and sort of a byproduct of this that to me is fascinating is other people will have similar experiences. So someone might come and say, I was there, I know this feeling, maybe not this spot, but I recognize this, and there's this connection they have, and it's intense. It's interesting, and it's not something I set out, to create. It just happens.
But it's an interesting idea that, why not just a photo? You're both painters, but like if you find a photo, or you're taking the photo, it's like, why not just show the photo? Like, there's something about the materiality of paint, scale, and the activity. And I'm speaking for myself too, as a painter who works with photography as source imagery. It's not, the photo's not enough, and I don't consider myself a photographer. It's just a way to get started. It's a way to sort of build a composition or describe or define a place or a memory. And in your work, Mishael, you often, your wife Nadia will take photos. And so it's interesting to me that in a way there's a collaboration. I'm curious about how do you recompose these images? Are you going exactly the way that the photo comes out when you get that 4x6 printout?
So my wife Nadia took photographs. She's a gifted photographer as well. And she took photographs when she traveled to Ukraine last spring without me. The first trip was just going to the Polish border and helping refugees. This was like within the first 2 weeks. And it was super intense. And as part of the trip, she took some photographs. And we talked about it beforehand. I said, take my camera, just shoot something. I always worked in my own
That's the focus.
Yeah, I had to train her a little bit, but she's very talented. So she came back with lots of beautiful photographs. And so I was in this conundrum, these aren't my memories. But then we went together a month later, and after that trip, I'd been to the same places with her, and they were changed just in a few weeks, drastic change. But seeing those places myself kind of opened it up, and after that, using her imagery, it was just so important to use that imagery that captured those moments that were so intense.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't able to go back. I wasn't there then, but it was like it just felt too important.
Mm.
So yeah, it was definitely complicated.
Yeah.
That
For your process, introduce something new in your process in a way.
Yeah, and I've really resisted in the past people coming and saying, "Oh, I've got a really nice picture of my puppy. Can you paint it?" That kind of relationship. But this is different. That experience, having Ukraine enter my art, I guess, reset all the ground rules. So changed the considerations.
Yeah. Kaylee and I were talking yesterday, or when was it, Thursday? I don't know. Well, anyway, we were talking about photography in relation to the paintings, and one of the things that came up about Wilhelm's work was the iterations of similar motifs.
Mm-hmm.
There are, the Oxbow Lake with the fiery sky. There are several of those paintings, and the paintings they differ in various ways in terms of like how high the horizon line is or how low, the cloud structures, and so there's kind of variations on a theme. And we were talking about the idea of additions or maybe reproduction or the photo, like in photography where there can be multiples. Does this strike a chord with you in any way?
Definitely, I think there's something like a series.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the right word?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's an addition. I think addition is like coming from printmaking, and later picked up by photography. It's literally the same thing, or identical image of normally the same source, like lithography or edition. So in that sense, I don't think they're additions, but there are a series kind of surrounding an idea or thought, trying out in different ways, right? And they're trying to get to know it better. So I think it's a form of, it's both. It's like kind of maybe a dance around something. It can be very playful, the idea of variation of a motif or idea. Can also be very analytical, right? And I guess the fascination of a series is that the truth is not necessarily in one picture, but in the series, or maybe in between, right? So, and famous, think of Cézanne's Moisson Victoire. So you did that mountain before, why are you doing it again? And he's coming back, and the motif is only like a kind of a carrier or a vessel for an idea, and you use it over and over again to celebrate or elaborate the idea, right? Monet's aesthetics of the Blanc facade and so on and so on. So artists, have painted the same motif throughout their entire life, right? And we were talking about limitation earlier. It actually allows you to focus on something, right? Or if we think about music, the well-tempered piano. It's a very limited form, but it goes forever.
Yeah.
Right? So variation is a form of analyzing, of learning, of maybe celebrating a material and seeing how many ways you can
And so,
present it.
right. So for you, there's never one ultimate version of that motif.
No. Well, the next one when you do it. The next one, maybe the next one.
And Michelle, are you making multiple versions of any of these paintings and then deciding, well, this is the one that I want to show, or this is the one that is the ultimate?
I wish. Yeah, my time is limited. So when I'm in the studio, usually I'm working on one piece, and when I'm done with that, it's time to open a new door and start on something else. Because I wouldn't feel like I was moving enough. I don't know how to say that, but it it wouldn't be enough momentum. And I have done some experiments with similar scenes in Paris a few years ago, and that was interesting. I mean, it was interesting. I don't think I gravitate towards that because it's almost like once I've kind of done it once, I kind of get kind of impatient, and I kind of want something totally different, kind of like a kid getting bored with a toy. And so once you go through the process, then you're looking for, okay, I need something, totally different colors, I need something, and it's just temperament, I think, people are different that way. And,
I mean, it's an interesting question, where's this line, and I think it's a thin line between a series and a body, what we call a body of work, right? I mean, if I see the Budapest scenes, right, I mean, that could also be, two paintings out of a series, right? Dealing with the same motif in a similar aesthetic, right? I mean, I don't know how strict the definition of either one is.
So one more question, and then we can open it up and have open up the conversation. And it's related to what we've just been talking about in terms of your process and making the paintings, and also developing what is a recognizable style in your work. When I see either one of these artists work online, I recognize it immediately. I don't need to read who it is. I know whose work this is. And that's, for all artists, that's something that we're trying to achieve. We're trying to make work that's recognizable and has our signature style. And so, letting that be a truth in our work, how long have you been making paintings in the current style, and what is changing for you now, if anything?
It's hard to say. I mean, maybe it does change constantly, and then it's hard to say since when I did do that, because there's no point in time saying, that's not what I'm doing, right? I mean, if I look back now at things that I did 10 or 15 years ago, I would say yes, there something has, I'm not sure it has progressed, but it has definitely changed. Yeah, I don't know.
What about thinking forward? What's evolving for you in your studio practice right now?
Well, I mean, every work is kind of coming out of the ones before. So I almost think of it like, what's it called? Crocheting, where each loop holds the previous one and will hold the next one. And that's literally how you create like a connection, which ideally is, a fabric or a tissue. And so what I said about the drips, previously cranberries and snow and stars, I don't know, there might be more. And so there, one idea, one form is born out of the previous one.
That can make it hard to see a hard edge.
Yeah.
Especially if you're an artist.
It's blurry.
Sure.
Yeah. That's true, but I mean, that's the beauty of it, that, it's a little bit like, this time you're looking at the garden, right? You can't really say, oh, now it grew, but it's constantly growing, right? And the next morning it's already somewhat different.
I think for myself, probably 10 years-ish, but it's shifted during that time. I started more interested in the actual shapes in the blur, being more faithful to them, and gravitated towards using them as sort of thumbnails for placement of brush marks that are more like rectilinear. So, and liking that effect, slightly pixelated, like organically pleasing, and it somehow it tickles your eyes get tickled by it, and it maybe because you can't resolve it completely, but yeah, it's hard to say when sort of start to happen.
Sure. But then as it's developing for you, and you just described sort of the shapes were important, and now maybe it's more about the brush mark and those details that you're savoring at the end of a painting. Where do you imagine that's going? Or maybe it's not even a unknown thing. Maybe there's a deliberate thing you're trying to shift the work into.
So, I mean, I'll be honest, right now, my life involves so many directions that I'm sometimes just clawing forward to keep a steady momentum in the studio. So to keep, just to feel like I'm putting in the time to maintain that awareness of what I'm doing. Because if it takes too long a break, you really start from the beginning, and it's like, I'm going to art school the first day, and I don't remember anything. And so when, if I can keep that going, and if I'm lucky enough to have enough time to work continuously, that's when an evolution will come. And I don't know what it will be. I don't know. I think the important thing is to stay faithful to your instincts in each moment, even if they're wrong, but just to trust them, because they will be right at some point and you'll recognize it. And
I have a little addition to what the initial question about having every artist wants to have their own style. Actually, some artists want to make sure that they're not recognized, which is really fascinating. They kind of like try to work in ways that is actually not theirs, and appropriation of it was all about.
Okay, sure.
And I'm super afraid that, or let's put it that way, I'm very concerned with the fact that it's hard to have one's own style, especially in times of social media where we actually see each other's work all the time that size, right? So it's hard to actually develop something that's not naturally informed by what we see all the time, right? And I don't know, I feel like what we do is, this is art. Like it's made of so many other things that are out there, and we kind of believe it's ours, which I think is probably smart and a little naive too. But it's very. I doubt that we have like very original styles. I mean, for myself.
How about our wonderful audience today? Ricky, I don't know if you wanted to interject anything? Or?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. And we would love to open it up for questions for artists, for a moderator, if anyone has any. Yeah.
I have a question for both, actually. Mishael first. So we had a lot of talk earlier about the imitation of painting and also the usage of photo. And when you have the photo available for you, do you, how much you think of the time and temperature of the photo in relationship to what the painting would be?
so, temperature, you mean like the color temperature? Or
Yeah, color temperature, or like what it should be, like 6 a.m. in there.
Oh, nice.
Time
of day.
The time of day, yeah, I mean, those things are important to me. For me, if the painting is successful, it communicates as much of that information as possible. Maybe more than the photograph. So my hope is that the photograph is like the diving board, and the painting is the dive, is the execution.
That's beautiful comparison. Because I really think that your painting has to do with certain specificity, like it has to be in that evening. So that's really
Good question.
Yeah. And Mom, I have another question for you. So it's
Oh, I get
something.
my own.
Doctor,
Wait, what was the question?
two questions. One is just about what you said, or like the last commentary you had in this talk about the originality and the social media and everything. It's hard for me to think of, but at the same time thinking about it all the time. Contemporary art making practice is really about interwoven of everything has been happening the last 30 years and the last 5,000 years.
Exactly, yeah.
But like what I mean by 30 years is because the internet era, the archive of what we have in this whole social media, I think that's something that inevitably happened in a certain degree, and I halfway agree with what you just said.
I mean, I understand what I was saying is somewhat, I guess, provocative, because there's no way out.
No.
If you go back in art history, artists were traveling in order to see other artists, in order to work the same way. So, so we coming out of a tradition, we coming out of a, local environment, we see what our peers do and we inspire each other, or try to work away from what other people do. Yes, we're not, we're involved in a bigger context.
Okay, one quick other question is, do you ever think of hypothetically subliminal space when you make your scene, like the big part of the sky and the mountain? It's like overhead point of view, at least some of the paintings here.
Yeah.
Because the first reaction I had was the sublime from Casper Frederick types of filming. So I was just curious.
Yeah, I mean, that's where we're coming back to an interest, in a kind of concept of landscape rather than a specific landscape. And if you look at German Romanticism, for example, if you would analyze them, they're actually very, structured or very composed rather than depicting a specific place. And it's a lot about a horizon line, that's going back to Dutch painting, a certain amount of sky versus a certain amount of land. So I know it sounds horrible, but there's almost like a formula behind it. There's something formulaic, which makes it, again, very, concept related. And I think that's something I'm really interested in. It's also, I feel like it's a very abstract, an approach of thinking about abstractly, abstract, in an abstract way.
And it's fascinating because you earlier mentioned about the word specifically yearning.
Yeah.
And in Korean language, where I'm coming from, the word drawing and the word yearning is the same pronunciation.
Yearning.
And drawing is the same
Wow,
word.
that's beautiful.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, another artist that comes to mind in this context is Mark Rothko, right? We would consider completely abstract, but there's something about, just proportion and balance and stuff, and it's closely related to, I think, landscape composition, right? And there's something about projection and yearning without any tree. I never saw a tree, at least.
You missed the tree.
Yes.
First of all, I wanted to congratulate Mishael and Wilhelm. It's a handsome show. And I was thinking of, when I was coming over today, I was thinking of the title you guys came up with, Standing Still. She came up with it. So the interior question was, who thought of it? And
We want it still standing.
Exactly.
They don't get the final choice.
Well, it's a good title. I think that for me, I was thinking, before this talk about that, it was like the frozen moment of photography, and then when photography came up so much in practices, I thought, well, that probably has a lot to do with it. Does it have anything to do with the fact that this body of work was pretty much conceived and produced during the pandemic, that was standing still, everybody was standing still? Or was it-
That's an interesting take. So the title is actually conceptualized by our gallery owner, Abigail. And I think in the greater scheme of the artists that we're showing right now, we're showing a lot of fibers work, we're showing a lot of really bright electric colors, which are here as well. But both of these painters are really giving you a moment to stop and look at the work in a way that I think some of our other artists don't do. And thinking especially about the selection of Mishael's work that we have on view right now with these Ukraine paintings. These are all moments of peace within that series. This is coming from a larger series that was exhibited back in October as well. But yeah, these are all just moments of peace. And then thinking about Wilhelm's, especially like these starry nights, when you're taking the time to stop and look at the stars, you are standing still. There's something very calming about it.
Actually, geographically, they're all very close. And I mean, I don't know where your brain, your picture space, but they're all sort of European, I guess.
Well, that's a very good question. Again, my audience often asks, like, so where is this? Oh, I know where this is. I've been there, so like, really? I think that's so interesting that you have landscapes here side by side, and in your work, actually by showing the flag, you almost putting in color that's literally determining kind of a national kind of you put the needle, so to speak, on the map, and I feel like I'm trying to get away from that by showing a landscape that could be anywhere, and I think in that sense it's like formalistically we're not that far apart, and I think that makes it a very very good dialogue to see those different approaches side by side.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I have a question for Wilhelm. When I see your work, I really was struck by Sea of Ice by Caspar Friedrich. So I'm wondering about your relationship with that painting, and maybe like it was like in back one of your files. And also there's a second part. And also in a really lovely way, they also remind me of Corot and his paintings in Italy. The excitement he had with the materials and the light, and so in a way it's kind of strange that you've got this marriage happening in a wonderful way. But I'm wondering too, if the 9 paintings had a certain conception point. Because all I've seen is the red ones.
Okay, Friedrich first. First things first. I mean, I'm with my interest in the 19th century Romanticism coming out of Germany, there's almost no way around Caspar David Friedrich, right? And Sea of Ice, or like I think The Lost Hope is also called, because there's a shipwreck in there, which is the name of the ship was Hope. But there's something beautiful in terms of famously sublime in terms of like how the human dimension gets lost and all those like blocks of ice kind of build up. And this type of painting is at the center, like this type of painting of this period in our history has been at the center of my interest over the last years. Especially, I revisited learning more and more about the Hudson River School, which was going back to German or European Romanticism. And again, we mentioned Friedrich before. I think it's not, some of his landscapes again are very specific, but this landscape that you just mentioned is much more a metaphor. Right. We wouldn't say like, oh, how many degree north, how many.
Well, that's why I saw. Yeah, that's why I saw your work is very metaphoric.
Right.
As well.
So we're talking about a mood. We're talking about the sublime, which is a mood, which is like where the picturesque and the scary kind of hit each other. Right. It's amazing in a way. Whoa, but it's also scary. Right? So I know some of that undertones I would love to. I hope I can share in my work as well. Corot, you said, right? So what I like about Corot, when he went to Italy, there's large paintings, but there's just as beautiful the little studies that he did, and contemporary of his did at the time. So they traveled to the south and literally worked plein air and painted those beautiful little kind of depictions of hamlets and little farms, maybe ruins. Is that what you're thinking?
I'm thinking about actually when you're painting the earth and the ground and the more like rock and surfaces of things. That's when I get the connection with your work.
Yeah.
Like the excitement of the materials and
You're thinking, sorry, Corot or Cobbett?
Corot
too,
really.
okay.
Yeah. Because landscape and the pigments from the earth, it's just a perfect marriage,
Nice.
and the excitement.
Yeah.
And so that's what I get in your work.
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely super interested in this type of, again, landscape study too, where there's also something about, because it was often done plein air, it was kind of quick.
Yeah.
There's something about the handling of the material and to move the brush or the palette knife.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, definitely, if you go to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, for example, they have this beautiful gallery, just like tiny little studies they were done at the time. There are Corots in there as well. Yeah. I think it's the third part.
No, I'm wondering when you can see like the conception of the lights.
There's and it's actually related to photography and photographer. I was flipping through a catalog of Wolfgang Tillmans, who had a big show, I think, at MoMA this year, last year. And there was a bunch of kind of abstract skyscapes. And that was when the idea came up that the cranberries could be stars. But that, yeah, from there, you know, I felt like I had the ingredients already handy for this type of painting. And then we're coming back to this kind of almost formulaic, which again, I feel a little weird about, but in a way it's like, oh, I got this, and then
But it's so different. I mean, it's very dramatic. It's more like Bernstein's drama. You know, it's super dramatic as opposed to the quietude of.
yeah. Well, and that's, there we talk about, you know, variation. You can push it into one or the other direction and try to, how far do you want to go?
Well, it's exciting to see the development.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
I was trying to think of a question, but I think I have more of a response, which is, it's really interesting to see both of your work paired, and in a sort of a masculine way, there is extreme sentimentality in these pieces that is just so beautiful, and I found it's like a commonality to you both. And in a way, I know your photographs are referencing something personal to you, but for me today, they're more about that sentimentality and that sense of yearning and longing and intimacy with the place, or the longing for intimacy in Wilhelm's places, or the trepidation of what might transpire, you know, but it's sort of a conflict. But, so I'm appreciating that with both of your work, and it's pretty remarkable. And not to be seen online ever. I mean, it's just not the same for me.
Right.
Yeah, that's actually, like, for painters, I think the whole online thing is both a blessing and a curse.
It's just suffering.
You get the stuff out there, but it will never look right.
Yes, yeah.
That's what it calls a picture. Awesome.
One more. We got
Wilhelm, I just was thinking in that last comment, it reminded me when you were talking about the armchair traveler as a way to access the inaccessible. And now with the internet, we have so much access to landscapes and imagery. Does that change your interpretation of how you want your works to be received, how we're supposed to receive them as viewers?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, ideally you don't see them from your armchair, but you see them here in the gallery, right? Because talking about, you know, paint versus color, I mean, this is something that can only really unfold in a physical space while you're in front of the work. I'm not sure if that's the answer to your question.
No, that makes sense.
So a little anecdote, I teach German on the side at Harvard College, and my boss at some point said, like, you know, there are all those museums, they have those high-res images now online, and you can literally, like, you know, walk through the museum online and zoom into, you know, and we're literally like 2 buildings, like a minute by foot from the Harvard Art Museums, which is a museum with a high-end collection dedicated to serve the students. And I said, but you know, it's right there. So we have a fascination, actually. I think as armchair travelers, we get more and more professional, like, you know, shifting from the painting to the digital image. So there is a risk of, you know, definitely not going to the original landscape, but not even going to the maybe more elaborate landscape of the painting anymore.
Thank you all for your great questions. Thank you both to the artists and to the gallery.